When you hear the word saint, what comes to mind? Someone with a halo, a stained glass window made after them, maybe a church named after them, or maybe just a person whose holiness seems so extraordinary that you could never imagine being like them. But is that what a saint really is? Welcome to Teach My Heart, where we explore faith questions with curiosity and humility in order to know God more deeply. And today we're asking, what's a saint? To answer this question, let's begin with scripture. One of the things that surprises many people is that the word saint didn't begin with the Catholic Church. It's used throughout the New Testament. For example, in the opening of his letter to the Romans, St. Paul writes, "To all God's beloved in Rome who are called to be saints." Notice who Paul is writing to. Not people who had already died, not people who were living perfect lives. He's writing to ordinary Christians living in Rome, people who were still struggling, still dealing with temptation, still learning how to follow Christ. The word saint comes from the Latin word sanctus, which simply means holy. In the broad sense, the church refers to all of Christ's faithful, those on earth, those being purified, and those already in heaven as saints. Because through Christ, we have all been called to holiness. The Catechism of the Catholic Church echoes this when it says, "All Christians are called to the fullness of Christian life and the perfection of charity." So, what's a saint? In the broad sense, you, me, every member of Christ's faithful here on earth, in purgatory, and in heaven. But I have a feeling that's not why you clicked on this episode. You're probably wondering about the saints with a capital S, the men and women whose lives continue to inspire us centuries later. So let's take a look at what they all have in common. When we think about saints, it's easy to focus on what made them different. Some were priests, others were parents, some were scholars, others were missionaries, some lived in monasteries, and others lived ordinary lives in their communities. But if you look beneath all of those differences, you'll find something remarkable. Every saint had one thing in common. They trusted God and cooperated with His grace. And little by little, day by day, they chose His will over their own. God isn't looking for perfect people, He's looking for willing hearts. Take St. Peter. Peter loved Jesus. He left everything to follow him. But when Jesus was arrested, Peter denied even knowing him 3 times. Most of us would probably think that kind of failure would have been the end of the story. Instead, it became the beginning. After the resurrection, Jesus forgave Peter, restored him, and entrusted him with leading his church. Peter's failure didn't define him. His willingness to trust God's mercy did. Then there's St. Paul. Before becoming Christianity's greatest missionary, Paul persecuted Christians. He approved of the execution of St. Stephen and tried to destroy the church. Yet, after encountering the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, everything changed. God transformed a persecutor into an apostle. Paul's past didn't define him. His willingness to say yes to God did. A few centuries later came St. Augustine. For years, he searched for happiness and success, relationships, pleasure, and philosophy. He even prayed, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." But eventually, Augustine discovered what so many of us discover. Our hearts remain restless until they rest in God. His wandering didn't define him. His surrender did. Several centuries later, a young woman named St. Catherine of Siena spent her life encouraging others, including popes, to trust God more completely. A saying often attributed to her beautifully captures the heart of sainthood. Be who God meant you to be, and you will set the world on fire. Whether those words were her exact words or not, they express a profound truth. God isn't asking us to become someone else. He's asking us to become the person He created us to be. Like Maximilian Kolbe, he was a Polish priest who was imprisoned at Auschwitz during World War II. After a prisoner escaped, 10 men were chosen to die by starvation in retaliation. When one of those men cried out for his wife and children, Maximilian Kolbe stepped forward and volunteered to take his place. Inside the bunker, instead of giving in to despair, witnesses recalled that he spent his final days leading the other prisoners in prayer and ministering to and encouraging them as they died, one by one. He was the last one to die. That extraordinary act of love didn't happen overnight. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent saying yes to God. The list of saints goes on, spanning different centuries, countries, personalities, and different vocations. But they all have one thing in common. They trusted God's will for their life. And that's exactly why we still tell their stories today, which raises another question. If all Christians are called to become saints, why does the Catholic Church officially recognize certain people? The answer will surprise you. The Church doesn't make saints, God does. The Church simply recognizes certain men and women whose lives clearly reflect the transforming power of God's grace. As the Catechism says, by canonizing some of the faithful, the Church recognizes the power of the Spirit of holiness within her and sustains the hope of believers by proposing the saints to them as models and intercessors. The canonized saints remind us that the gospel isn't just something to believe, it's something that can actually be lived. So, what's a saint? A saint isn't someone who never sinned, who never doubted, never failed. A saint is an ordinary person who trusted an extraordinary God, someone who kept saying yes, who got back up after falling, who allowed God's grace to transform them. And that's why saints matter. Not because they're people we'll never become, but because they remind us of who God is calling us to be. The goal of the Christian life isn't simply to reach heaven, it's to become holy, because holiness is how God prepares us for heaven. The saints show us that this is possible, not because they were extraordinary, but because God is faithful. He is still calling ordinary people today, people like you, people like me. And if He can transform Peter, Paul, Augustine, Catherine, Maximilian, just imagine what He can do for you. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Teach My Heart. If it helped you get to know God just a little bit more, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode when we ask, do animals go to heaven? Until then, keep seeking understanding.